The great palaces of Europe, Versailles, El Escorial, the Hofburg were not only symbols of opulence, but laboratories of submission. Behind brocade curtains and beneath gilded ceilings, monarchs exercised a form of domination that transcended politics. It was personal, carnal, and psychologically catastrophic. In these courts, the notion of divine kingship metastasized into something darker, an appetite that did not hide but disguised itself as tradition. The selection of royal favorites was never random. They were boys, always boys chosen, in adolescence, plucked from noble lineages or beautiful poverty, and trained not for war or council, but for presence. Their grooming was meticulous. How they walked, how they bowed, how they smiled, and eventually, how they obeyed. Cloaked in euphemisms like valet or companion, they were ushered into an orbit that seemed like privilege but was in truth a prison. Their loyalty was rewarded with land, title, and access but never autonomy. They lived in rooms adjacent to the king's own chambers where pleasure and surveillance were indistinguishable. This was not affection. This was choreography. Every gesture reinforced hierarchy. Every embrace was a contract. Love was not love, it was currency, paid in silence and compliance. The kings in turn wrapped their desire in sacred cloth. To question the relationship was to question the crown. The church turned its gaze, the ministers played along, and the courtiers, whispering behind lace fans, understood the rules. Power excused all things, and beauty in a boy was a danger as much as a gift. But the cruelty ran deeper than violation. It was identity manipulation. These boys were not merely taken, they were reshaped. Their masculinity was not denied, but redefined. They were polished into living ornaments, taught to entertain, to dance, to flatter, to soothe. Their clothes, sometimes more elaborate than the queen's, were a costume for survival. Their emotions, carefully muted, became performance. In public, they laughed. In private, they wept into silk. Asterisk, if you've made it this far into the shadows of history, help this channel grow, like the video, subscribe for more dark true stories, and comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support keeps these buried truths alive. Asterisk. The most grotesque irony is that the same society that demanded their submission mocked them for it. Whispers of effeminacy, satirical pamphlets, nicknames like the King's Lily or His Majesty's Nightingale. The court spread them to be queens in all but name, then punished them for playing the part. These were not courtships, they were erasures of boyhood, of autonomy, of voice. Many were given to the king by their own family's fathers, bartering beauty for favor. The exchange was understood. Proximity to the monarch was the highest honor, even if it meant offering your son as an emotional concubine. For the monarch, desire became entitlement. The body of the favorite was not loved, it was claimed. Possession became policy. Some kings elevated multiple boys in succession, discarding them once they aged beyond the threshold of usefulness. Others became obsessed, spiraling into jealousy, surveillance, and brutal control. A missed visit, a private conversation, even a changed tone could spark exile or worse. Psychologically, the monarchs deteriorated. Desire unchallenged mutates into delusion. They saw betrayal in glances, rebellion in disobedience, and righteousness in punishment. One king, convinced his favorite had taken a lover, forced him to marry a woman he despised, only to annul it weeks later in a public humiliation ritual. Another imprisoned his companion in a monastery for a year, to cleanse him of disloyal thoughts. These were not acts of justice, they were theatrical executions of trust. Public displays of private wounds. The boys, too, fractured under the weight of their roles. Some vanished into exile, disgraced and erased from history. Others took their own lives' quiet deaths, footnoted in royal diaries, filed as melancholy or fever. A few survived by becoming shadows, serving as eunuch-like advisors in their later years. Their beauty faded, their trauma concealed behind courtly smiles. And yet the tradition endured. From England to France, Russia to Spain, sultans and emperors mimicked the pattern. Because the system was not designed to satisfy affection, it was engineered to sustain dominance. In a world where kings could not be questioned, they did not seek equals, they sought mirrors. And the most obedient mirrors were those too young, too vulnerable, and too desperate to shatter. This is where the story begins, not with one king, but with a pattern, not with a scandal, but with a system. The chamber doors are now open, and the echoes are unbearable. What was once ritual is now revelation, and what seemed like affection was always a form of violence, wrapped in velvet and silence. Asterisk. The throne of England had never looked so lonely. Behind its carved oak and velvet cushions sat a man whose crown weighed heavier with each passing year. King James, the first scholar, theologian, defender of divine right, was, at his core, a creature of aching insecurity, raised in violence, manipulated in childhood, and long estranged from his own reflection. James entered kingship with a hunger not for justice, but for affirmation. It was not a woman nor a warrior who first filled this void, but a boy. Robert Carr was beautiful in a way that disturbed the court. Not for his face, but for what his face did to the king, a page boy of Scottish birth, unlettered and provincial. Carr had no claim to power. His only currency was Present's soft eyes, a gentle neck, and the unfortunate timing of falling from a horse before the king's gaze. That fall rewrote history. James saw the boy's body sprawled across the tilture, and declared it divine intervention. From that moment, the boy was no longer a servant. He was a reflection. Carr's transformation began with silks. Tailors were summoned to design garments that shimmered more than any worn by the queen. Jewels framed his throat, gloves softened his hands, and courtiers whispered that he had become not a man, but a mirror one that flattered the king's need to be adored. James called him sweet child in letters inked with trembling affection. Their physical closeness grew more performative, more theatrical kisses placed not in secrecy, but in ceremony. It was not mere favoritism. It was fetishized loyalty, rebranded as divine providence. But Carr was not ready for court. He stammered in council meetings, misunderstood treaties, and mistook manipulation for mentorship. Those around him, the Howard faction, nobles drunk on proximity to power, him like a velvet key. Policies were signed through the softness of his voice. Secrets were spilled into his lap and filtered to enemies. But James refused to see the incompetence. The more Carr failed, the more James protected him. And the more James protected him, the more he needed to believe Carr was worthy. Affection became delusion, and delusion ossified into paranoia. The court, meanwhile, rotted in whispers. Nobles referred to Carr as the queen without a crown. Pamphlets hinted at knightly rituals and accused the king of transforming Westminster into a brothel of disguised submission. Some said Carr had been taught how to bow with the delicacy of a maid. Others claimed he had been made to wear rouge. Behind closed doors, his hands always folded, his speech rehearsed to sound more pleasing, more yielding, more feminine. In a world built on masculine dominance, Carr's entire existence became a living contradiction. He was elevated and emasculated in the same breath, used as a political fetish and discarded. As soon as his power became inconvenient, James, he began to unravel. Accusations of sodomy weren't what broke him. It was the fear that people no longer saw God in him, only guilt. His authority was no longer moral but carnal. He was mocked in foreign courts, satirized in sermons. Ministers began to speak to Carr instead of the king, knowing the boy's whisper carried more weight than royal decree. The final rupture came through a scandal of murder. Frances Howard, a woman of similar manipulation, used Carr to orchestrate the death of Sir Thomas Overbury, a man who had opposed her marriage to Carr. The poison was literal, but the decay was political. James, desperate to protect his sweet child, delayed justice, stalled trials, and exposed himself to ridicule. But Carr was no longer grateful. His ascent had birthed arrogance, and his survival instincts eclipsed any loyalty he once felt. When Carr was finally put on trial, the mask cracked. He begged the king to save him. He threatened to reveal the private letters, intimate confessions written in royal hand, confessions that blurred the line between affection and obsession. James caved. The letters were burned. Carr was exiled, but neither man ever recovered. Lived out his days a disgraced noble, stripped of dignity. James, haunted by the boy with the swan neck, retreated further into isolation. He died clutching a crown that no longer symbolized control, but shame. What began as love became governance. What was governance became theater. And what was theater became collapse. In the end, the boy was not crowned, but he did reign, not through title, but through submission. A monarch once feared across Europe had knelt not to an enemy, but to a reflection, and that reflection, like all illusions, shattered under the weight of truth. There was a silence to Louis XIII that unsettled even his closest advisors. It wasn't the silence of meditation or introspection, it was the silence of a child who had learned early that affection was conditional, that warmth came wrapped in politics, and that the throne was not a sanctuary, but a glass cage. Born into a court where cruelty wore perfume and piety masked ambition, Louis grew up encircled by two figures, a mother who ruled through intimidation, and a cardinal who wielded confession like a blade. Marie de' Medici taught him early that love could be revoked. Her moods dictated the weather of the palace, and her expectations drilled into him the art of obedience. When she wasn't instructing, she was withdrawing. When she wasn't threatening, she was praying. In her presence, Louis learned that masculinity meant passivity. He was a prince with a sword too heavy to lift, whose smile was rehearsed and whose childhood eroded beneath the weight of ceremonial gestures, but it was Cardinal Richelieu who taught him fear. A man of faith and calculation, Richelieu made piety a performance. He monitored the king's reading, controlled his appointments, and spoke to him not as a mentor but as a puppeteer cloaked in crimson. Under Richelieu's shadow, Louis withered. His voice never deepened in confidence, his posture never squared, and behind his royal signature was always the faint echo of someone else's pen. In such suffocation, the king began searching not for equals, but for shadows, men who would not challenge him, but reflect him. The first and most enduring was Charles d'Albert, a nobleman of no extraordinary intellect, but with a face so gentle it looked sculpted for devotion. Louis made him Duke of Lunens, bestowed on him more privileges than ministers twice his age, and placed him by his side at all moments. Lunens was neither strategist nor scholar, he was a comfort object in human form. To the court, it was an embarrassment. To Louis it was a necessity. Lunens never needed to earn the king's affection, he needed only to exist. Louis gave him jewels, titles, command over regiments he never led, and a proximity to power usually reserved for blood relatives. In court ceremonies, Lunens stood where queens were meant to. He was invited to royal retreats, granted honors before ambassadors, and often addressed in the language of devotion, not diplomacy. These gestures weren't simply favoritism, they were theater. And in this theater, Louis was both audience and actor, watching himself find comfort through the illusion of control. Anne of Austria, his wife, observed this silently. Married to Louis for political reasons, she became an ornament to a crown that refused to touch her. Years passed without consummation. Whispers spread that the king recoiled from her not out of disdain, but terror. He feared the body, especially the female one. He feared its unpredictability, its consequences, and its reminders of adulthood. Louis didn't simply avoid intimacy, he pathologized it. When pressured by court and clergy to produce an heir, Louis stalled, not with politics, but with ritual. He clung harder to Lunens, whose every gesture began to resemble a holy relic, blessed, untouchable, and necessary. The duke's outfits became more elaborate, his presence more theatrical. In public, he was the king's dearest. In private, he was a surrogate, a stand-in for all that Louis had lost in childhood: trust, gentleness, simplicity, and perhaps the illusion of love untainted by fear. But Lunens began to change. Power eroded his humility. He interfered in military decisions, replaced competent generals with loyalists, and made enemies faster than he made policy. Yet Louis remained blind. He forgave each transgression like a priest absolving sin, not because he didn't see, but because he couldn't bear to be alone. Dependency had fermented into paralysis. That then came Lunens's death. Sudden, abrupt, and for Louis, catastrophic. He didn't weep publicly, he simply retreated. Ministers described him as ghostly, more so than usual. He ate in silence. He refused to touch the queen. He began speaking of visions, of judgment, of boys who had once made him feel whole, now watching him from beyond. And though the body of Lunens was buried, his role was never replaced. Others tried to occupy his place, young men with softer features and obedient manners, but none satisfied the king's craving, because the craving was never for companionship, it was for reflection. Louis's palace became a mausoleum of arrested development. He ruled without vigor, signed edicts without conviction, and navigated France's wars with the emotional timidity of a boy forced to play dress-up. His ministers saw policy where there was only performance, his queen saw marriage where there was only mourning, and the nation saw a king, but behind the crown was a child who had never been taught how to grow. The horror of Louis XIII's reign was not in violence, but in vacancy. A monarchy hollowed out by a man who could never escape the psychological architecture of his boyhood. His favorites weren't lovers, they were avatars of innocence, lost and never recovered. They were symbols of a masculinity so fragile it had to be mirrored, never challenged. Louis XIII ruled France with trembling hands, not because he was weak, but because he was terrified of becoming strong. Strength required adulthood. Adulthood required intimacy, and intimacy had always meant surrender. In the hallways of Versailles, mirrors still hang silent, cold, decorative, but for Louis, every one of them once held a boy's face. smiling, silent, and staring back. Asterisk. Pedro of Castile ruled with fire beneath his skin, and suspicion coiled around his mind. They called him El Cruel, but cruelty was too sterile a word for what he made of love. His court was not one of justice or order, but a performance of fear. Every laugh, every glance, every whisper had to be weighed against his presence. In this theater of paranoia, no one rose faster or fell harder. Tan Juan Alfonso de Albuquerque Juan was no warrior, no strategist, no grand philosopher. He was a soft-featured courtier with grace, beauty, and a willingness to listen. For Pedro, that was enough. The boy became his confidant, his shadow, his possession. Titles were handed out like offerings: chamberlain, advisor, master of ceremonies. But these weren't honors, they were collars. Pedro didn't want a servant. He wanted an object that breathed, and in Juan he found the perfect surface to project his own fracture: loyalty to be broken and rebuilt, devotion to be corrupted and choreographed at first. Juan glowed with the attention. His robes grew heavier with gold. His voice began to matter in council. The court bowed differently when he passed. But beneath the surface of Pedro's affection was something jagged, something that turned even tenderness into a prelude to humiliation. The first rupture came without warning. A minor disagreement over the seating at a royal banquet. Trivial to anyone else, but for Pedro it was betrayal. That night, in front of guests and ministers, Juan was ordered to remove his tunic. Servants entered with women's garments: a corset, a silken skirt, powdered slippers. Laughter danced uneasily across the hall as Pedro insisted it was a jest, a masquerade of courtly play. But the eyes of the king were unblinking. The command was not a joke, it was a verdict. Juan obeyed. He had no choice. The garments were put on, the shame sealed. Then came the lashes, 5, 10, 20 delivered with performative ceremony. It was not punishment, it was ritual. Pedro transformed the throne room into a sanctum of dominance, where the favorite's pain became a public display of the king's omnipotence. Afterward, Pedro embraced him. He wept into Juan's shoulder, apologized, swore it was love that made him cruel, promised protection, elevation, immortality. Juan was returned to his position, even granted new honors, but something in him had buckled. He smiled when spoken to, but the corners of his mouth didn't move. He stood tall in the court, but only by bracing himself against silence. The cycle repeated, erratic, brutal, and precise. Pedro would raise Juan up with lavish affection, then dash him against the floor in eruptions of jealous rage. He believed others coveted his favorite. He saw desire in the glances of noblemen, treachery in the politeness of visiting emissaries. He began interrogating his ministers about what they thought of Juan. He stationed spies in the boys' quarters. He controlled his diet, his wardrobe, even his sleep. And when suspicion boiled over, so did the punishments. The court came to expect the spectacle: Juan forced to dance in women's heels until he collapsed, doused in wine and slapped for imagined flirtations, paraded like a courtesan before foreign dignitaries under the pretense of entertainment. Each humiliation was followed by gifts, rings, land, whispered vows of eternity. But nothing could mask the truth. Juan was no longer a man. He was a symbol, twisted into something between pet, consort, and prisoner. Even those closest to Pedro lived in terror, not of offending the king, but of being too kind to Juan. A compliment could end a career. A casual glance could mean exile. Pedro's obsession infected the palace like a disease. No gesture was safe. No silence was innocent. Some tried to intervene. A bishop once approached the king, cautioning him that his conduct had become a scandal. In Rome, Pedro had the man banished before sunset. Another courtier, a friend of Juan since childhood, attempted to help him escape. His body was found 3 days later in a well outside Toledo, his throat slit, his hands bound in satin ribbons. Juan endured, not out of loyalty, but because survival had become his only currency. He learned how to flatter Pedro's madness, how to play the role of enchanted captive. He smiled when struck, he wept when praised, and every day he died a little more behind the eyes. Eventually he was allowed to flee quietly, discreetly, with no explanation to the court. But he left behind more than titles and gold. He left behind a ghost. In every hallway, his memory lingered, not as a man, but as a warning. The boy who had once walked beside the king now haunted the palace through rumor and fear. His reputation had been mutilated, his name reduced to a punchline whispered behind fans and cloisters. Pedro never named another favorite. He didn't need to. The court remained haunted, its atmosphere shaped by the ritual of pain he had carved into its rituals. Ministers walked with caution. Courtiers avoided each other's eyes, and the throne itself seemed to absorb the echo of screams that no one dared recall. This was not favoritism, this was bondage. Love used as punishment, devotion turned into a cage. Pedro didn't desire one, he needed him to mirror his control, to absorb his paranoia, to be reshaped endlessly until the king could no longer see where he ended and the boy began. And in that merger, something ancient was revealed, that absolute power does not merely corrupt, it mutilates, slowly. In the winter halls of the Russian court, where snow never melted from the heart, Peter III withdrew from reality and into fantasy, heir to empire but alien to affection. The boy who would be Tsar grew up starved of maternal warmth and humiliated by his Prussian handlers. When he finally seized the throne in 1762, it wasn't governance he pursued, it was compensation, and in the eerie silence of his private chambers, he began constructing a world where domination wore silk and submission wore rouge. Sergei was a stable boy, beautiful, quiet, obedient, exactly what Piotr wanted, not a lover, not a threat, but a canvas, someone onto whom the broken Tsar could paint his own vision of loyalty, beauty, and control. The boy was summoned under the pretense of service, but once inside the royal quarters, he disappeared from the world. No records, no visitors, only whispers, and behind velvet-lined doors, the Tsar's true obsession took shape. He called it the doll court. It began with mannequins, dozens of them crafted to resemble courtiers, rivals, even Catherine herself. They were dressed in ceremonial gowns, posed into frozen tableau, and referred to by title. Piotr spoke to them, held mock councils, danced with them, but the center of it all was Sergei. The boy was not simply dressed, he was transformed. Corsets were sewn to crush his ribs into an hourglass, wigs powdered and styled daily. He was perfumed, painted, taught to curtsy. Every movement was choreographed, every word forbidden. Piotr renamed him Anastasia, after a Romanov princess whose portrait he kept by the bedside. Sergei became her shadow, mute, motionless, entirely artificial. At court, rumors festered. Ministers noticed the Tsar's withdrawal, his erratic decrees, his childlike tantrums, but none dared question the closed wings of the Winter Palace. It was only when a servant leaked tales of drugged meals, forced performances, and a throne room repurposed into a boudoir for painted boys that the horror spilled into politics. Catherine was silent, but not ignorant. She had endured her husband's humiliations for years, his obsession with toy soldiers, his worship of Frederick the Great, his revulsion toward her body. But this was different. This wasn't mere madness. It was monstrosity masquerading as nostalgia. Piotr wasn't just avoiding real women, he was trying to replace them, to banish their unpredictability by crafting submissive males in powdered mimicry. Every day Sergei's presence grew more symbolic. He was made to sit beside Piotr during private ceremonies, to dress as a queen during fabricated banquets, where lifeless mannequins filled the seats. Piotr would toast to his beauty, recite invented poems, and collapse into tears when the boy flinched. Love, to the Tsar, had become theater, and Sergei was both stage and actor. Nobles begged Catherine to act. Diplomats sent coded messages to Berlin and Vienna. One letter from a court physician described a scene of such psychological depravity that it read like fiction. Sergei drugged, cradled in the Tsar's lap, while Piotr played a violin and whispered lullabies in broken German. Another account spoke of mannequins dressed in mourning, positioned to weep beside a replica of Catherine's empty throne. What made this horror so profound was its reversal. It wasn't that the Tsar sought pleasure, it was that he sought to erase reality. Sergei's transformation was not seduction, it was erasure. His masculinity, his voice, even his name had been stripped away and replaced with obedience and painted femininity. Not for lust, but for power. For a king who could not conquer his court, it was easier to conquer the body of a boy who could not protest. And yet, there was no intimacy, no confessions of love, no whispers of passion, only performance. A hollow mirror through which tried to see the affection he had never received. In his world, queens didn't think, women didn't speak, and power came not from ruling the living, but from puppeteering the silent. Then came Catherine's coup. In July of 1762, with the support of the guards and the Orthodox clergy, Catherine moved. Piotr was arrested, exiled to Ropsha, and officially declared mentally unfit to rule. Within a week he was dead. The official cause a sudden illness, the unofficial truth a politically sanctioned assassination. His body, once adorned in imperial robes, was buried without ceremony. and Sergei he vanished. No burial, no records, no testimony. Some claimed he was sent to a monastery under a new name. Others whispered he had been smuggled abroad, his mind shattered and his identity erased. But most believed he was silenced, a living relic of a regime too grotesque to memorialize. In the years that followed, Catherine never spoke of the doll. Court she ruled with iron and reform, reshaping Russia into an empire of enlightenment. But in her private writings, there is one peculiar phrase, repeated more than once: "Let the mannequin sleep." No explanation, no context. Perhaps she, too, was haunted. Pyotr's reign was brief, but its legacy is immortal in shame. He took a boy and turned him into a doll. He turned governance into performance. He turned a palace into a playhouse of silence and delusion. And in doing so, he revealed a truth that few empires dare confront: that power, unchallenged, does not just corrupt the ruler, it consumes the ruled. And somewhere, behind the cracked mirrors of history, the doll still waits, frozen, painted, forgotten. In the silken corridors of the Mughal court, beauty masked violence and music drowned the cries of mutilated childhoods. Among the opulence of Persian carpets and jeweled ceilings, there existed a world not of concubines or generals, but of those who lived between definitions. The Khwajus, neither fully male nor female, neither free nor enslaved, they were the empire's most trusted servants and its most tragic sacrifices. The word eunuch fails to capture the layered horror of what they endured. Most were not born into this fate. They were taken, stolen as children from Hindu or Afghan households, traded by slavers and delivered into imperial hands. Their steel was the gatekeeper to favor. Castration was not only physical mutilation but spiritual branding. It erased the boy and birthed a function. From the moment their voices broke, they were silenced, reshaped into living instruments of loyalty. And among them rose Khwaja Jahan Farrukhsiyar, the fragile emperor who ruled from 1713 to 1719, was a man hollowed by fear, fear of poison, fear of rebellion, fear of love. He trusted no one, not wives, not brothers, not viziers, but in Jahan he found what he believed was purity. No lineage to threaten him, no heirs to challenge him, no woman's ambition, just obedience. Perfected Khwaja Jahan became the emperor's shadow, visible in every audience hall. Seated just behind the throne, dressed in silks finer than those of royal concubines. He spoke little but was listened to. He touched no one but was untouchable. His presence alone became both spectacle and warning. Here was a being so completely reshaped by the state that even nature had submitted. But this was no romantic ascension. The palace whispered of Farrukhsiyar's moods, nights spent drinking from cups held only by Khwaja Jahan, outbursts quelled only by his touch. Ministers grew resentful, not because of lust but because of the power it gave. Decisions began to move through this quiet favorite. Petitions were denied without his nod, punishments delivered at his glance. The emperor had found more than a confidant. He had found an emotional doppelganger, someone so molded by royal will that there was no distinction between master and mirror. And here lay the deepest horror. Khwaja Jahan had no desire of his own. He could not. Desire was a luxury of those with futures. He had no bloodline to protect, no surname to pass, no lover to miss. His role was to feel what Farrukhsiyar felt, to echo his hungers, to absorb his rage. Every smile was calibration, every gesture, performance. He was not loved, he was consumed. Foreign visitors wrote of the Mughal court's elegance, the peacock throne, the music, the fragrance of rosewater, but none wrote of what it took to manufacture such control. No parchment recorded the pain of a boy made into a ghost. No ode captured the agony of existing as an emperor's reflection, admired, needed, and never whole. Farrukhsiyar's dependency deepened as his paranoia grew. At court, he was a man of erratic policies and violent retribution. But in private, he wept in the arms of the one who had no arms to strike back. Khwaja Jahan was dressed in bridal fabrics on festival nights, walked with the emperor in moonlit gardens, and was tasked with judging the virtue of other men's wives, a grotesque irony, as he himself was barred from both masculinity and marriage. The royal court, ornate as it was, became a haunted theater. Ministers came to resent the eunuch not because he wielded power, but because his power revealed the emperor's weakness. Assassins were not sent with swords, but with rumors. They whispered of witchcraft, of unnatural sorcery, of feminine infiltration, and always of the throne's disgrace, not for having a favorite, but for being ruled by one. In 1719, the empire turned. Farrukhsir was deposed by his own nobles and executed, his body dragged through the streets, his name stripped from coins. Khwaja Jahan vanished. Some say he was murdered in the purge that followed. Others claim he escaped, living in secrecy as a holy man in the north, but history closed its eyes. The Mughal chronicles recorded his presence, then silence, as if to admit his story was to admit the system that birthed him, and yet his legacy lingers, not in marble, but in absence, in every tale of Mughal grandeur that forgets the price, in every song of devotion that skips the verse about those who were broken to serve. Khwaja Jahan was not a man, not a woman, not a lover, not a ruler. He was what power demanded, a vessel of erased identity, loyal not by choice, but by design. The seduction of empire was never merely wealth or conquest. It was the ability to shape human beings into myths, to turn trauma into ornament, to rewrite biology with titles and brocade. And when those myths outlived their use, they were buried beneath carpets of silk, spoken of only in hush, or not at all. Khwaja Jahan's story is not unique. He stands for hundreds, thousands, whose names did not survive the empire. They sustained, their bodies were the scaffolding of sovereignty, their silence, the lullaby of royal sleep, and in the folds of forgotten fabrics and vanished records, the question echoes still: what does it mean to be loved by a god who made you less than human? In the decaying twilight of European monarchy, as alliances cracked and the continent trembled under the weight of new ideologies, Germany's last emperor clung to something not forged in steel or strategy, but in fantasy. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the grandson of Queen Victoria and self-styled titan of the German Empire, was a man at war with his own body and haunted by emotional deformities far more debilitating than the withered arm. He kept carefully disguised in photographs. Power did not cure his need for affirmation. It amplified it, until the throne itself became a stage for psychological theater, one where the lines between affection, control, and delusion collapsed under velvet. Philip entered this stage quietly, a young aristocrat with soft eyes and a disposition described by some as unnervingly gentle. He arrived at court as a mere aide, but to Wilhelm he was something else entirely, a symbol of safety, loyalty, and unthreatening beauty. He called the boy mein Schatz, my treasure. Where generals brought reports, Philip brought smiles. Where diplomats maneuvered, he offered adoration. And in a world growing increasingly hostile to Wilhelm's unpredictable outbursts and political missteps, Philip became indispensable not for statecraft, but for emotional survival. Who had always harbored a deep suspicion of powerful women and an almost pathological aversion to confrontation, found in Philip what he could not summon in his advisors, his ministers, or even his wife: unconditional reflection. The boy laughed at his jokes, repeated his insecurities back as strengths, and never once mentioned the atrophied arm or the empire's fragile foundation. In return, Wilhelm elevated him to absurd heights. Philip received access to military briefings, keys to the emperor's private writing chambers, and even influence over public speeches meant for the Reichstag. Senior officials protested, but Wilhelm silenced them with threats, paranoia, and a growing detachment from reality. The German court, already a toxic cocktail of bureaucracy, nationalism, and aristocratic theater, grew quieter in the presence of Philip. Whispers circulated that the emperor had replaced real counsel with emotional ventriloquism. Officers reported seeing Philip in the war rooms, sitting silently as maps were spread, his eyes scanning over regions he barely understood. He wasn't offering advice. He was simply there, watching, smiling, present. But that presence began to corrode Wilhelm's already tenuous grip on leadership. He no longer trusted war ministers who didn't flatter him. He discarded military reports that contradicted his optimism. When asked for justification on critical decisions, he simply muttered, "Philip thinks it's right." It wasn't governance. It was delusion cloaked in proximity. And then the mask cracked. As the war turned and bodies piled up across Europe's fields, the inner circle began to rot. Reports of betrayal, telegrams intercepted. Philip, naive and emboldened, shared a private opinion, perhaps about a treaty, perhaps about the futility of war. Whatever it was, it collided violently with Wilhelm's need for absolute loyalty. In a single moment, the affection turned. The emperor summoned him. No tenderness, no explanation, just orders. Exile, return to your family. You are no longer needed. Philip left without a word, but his absence infected the palace like disease. Wilhelm spiraled. He demanded to see their old correspondence. He reread love notes disguised as imperial directives. He paced his study, muttering about betrayal and misinterpretation. But beneath the rage was mourning, not for the boy himself, but for the illusion he had built around him. Philip had not been real, he had been an idea, and the moment he voiced an independent thought, the idea shattered. Wilhelm never recovered. His political missteps turned catastrophic. As Germany burned, he retreated into isolation, and with him, the remnants of the fantasy. Exiled in the Netherlands after the war, he took only a handful of belongings, among them a small box of letters, a worn photograph, and a framed handkerchief once given by Philip. He told his servants to guard the items as sacred. He refused to speak of them in public, but at night, he would pull the box from beneath his bed and whisper to it as if it were a confessional. In one letter, he wrote, "You were the only soul who saw me and didn't flinch, and yet even you left me." But Philip had not left. He had been discarded the moment he ceased to reflect the emperor's need. That was the pattern. Wilhelm did not fear betrayal, he feared independence. He wanted dolls, not men, mirrors, not minds. And when they cracked, as all mirrors do, he blamed the world. The photograph remained on Wilhelm's desk until his death. It was never labeled, no name, no title, just a boy, smiling faintly, his eyes gazing not at the camera, but somewhere off-frame, as if already seeing the end. This is not a love story. It is a eulogy for the fantasy of control. Wilhelm, like so many monarchs before him, mistook affection for obedience and loyalty for silence. He built an empire not on diplomacy or wisdom but on the fragile scaffolding of emotional need. And when war tested that foundation, it collapsed, not just on him, but on millions. Philip lived a quiet life after exile. He never wrote publicly of the emperor, never published memoirs. He married, had children, and died in obscurity. But the photograph survived, passed down in his family, untouched, unexplained. In that image lies a caution of what happens when power demands intimacy but cannot handle truth. Wilhelm did not fall because he loved a boy. He fell because he could not love without possession, could not lead without illusion, and could not see the difference between an embrace and a prison asterisk. There is a particular cruelty in ritual, in its repetition, in how it dresses horror in tradition, and abuse in ceremony. Across centuries, beneath crowns and crests and sacred oaths, monarchs enacted not merely rule, but theater. And some stages demanded more than allegiance, they demanded both, not in war, not in law, but in bedchambers, in corridors, behind velvet curtains. There the most grotesque inversion of monarchy unfolded, not the making of kings, but the unmaking of boys. From James I's letters dripping with worship to Robert Carr, to Louis XIII's parading of adolescent favorites as consorts in all but name, from Pedro of Castile's staged humiliations to Peter III's living dolls, the pattern sharpened like a knife. Youth was not cherished, it was possessed, and not for innocence, but for pliability. The selection process itself became an imperial instinct. Who was beautiful enough to mimic a queen, who could be broken softly enough to never rebel. They called them pages, confidants, aides, companions, but what they truly were proxies. Silent portraits, walking reflections, tools, and by turning these boys into imitations of women, the kings weren't expressing love. They were enacting a fantasy in which affection could be chained, reshaped, owned. Masculinity, in their hands, became a weapon, not just against enemies, but against those closest to them, a twisted redefinition of power where domination masqueraded as intimacy. The tragedy deepens in the aftermath. These boys were not remembered. Their titles were often revoked, their names scrubbed from court documents, their portraits painted over. They were unmade in life and erased in legacy. Where their kings were buried with state honors, these boys were buried with secrets. Their trauma institutionalized, orchestrated, left no heirs, no monuments, only gaps in archives and whispers in memoirs. And yet, for all the concealment, the spectacle was never entirely private. These performances were staged before entire courts, dinners where the boy was seated beside the queen, ceremonies where titles were bestowed like wedding gifts, whispered scandals passed through the hands of foreign diplomats, embroidered in coded language. The horror wasn't simply that these kings acted in shadows, it's that they acted in full candlelight, and no one stopped them. The rituals were normalized, the abuse sanctioned by protocol, and the boys, they were praised for their loyalty, their beauty, their devotion, even as it destroyed them. This is the legacy of royal feminization, not queerness, not sexual freedom, but its perversion by hierarchy. It was not about identity, it was about inversion, taking a symbol of power the boy and bending him into a symbol of submission, and once bent, using him as proof that the king was untouchable. These were not partnerships, they were proofs of dominance. A sovereign could remake gender, affection, loyalty, even humanity, to suit his need, and the court would applaud. The psychological horror is not confined to the past. Institutions that thrive on hierarchy still perform these rituals. The silencing of those beneath power, the transformation of individuals into roles, the quiet expectation that obedience must come with erasure, the forced performance of loyalty dressed in politeness, servitude, smile. We see it not only in governments, but in corporations, religions, families, where power demands beauty, submission, silence, and calls it service. In the modern world, the feminized favorite may not wear corsets or powdered wigs, but the script remains. Deference dressed as mentorship, grooming called advancement, protection used as possession. The kings may wear suits instead of crowns, but they still demand obedience in exchange for proximity. They still demand transformation not of the system, but of the subordinate. The final horror, then, is not in what the monarchs did in secret. It is in what they trained the world to see as normal. The page boy beside the throne, the favorite, draped in jewels, the whispered rumors that faded as soon as power shifted, the performance of affection that hid the machinery of control. These were not anomalies. They were precedents, and they echo still. In biographies that glorify the king's eccentricity, but forget the boy's name. In historians who excuse predation as intimacy misunderstood. In royal museums that display the garments but not the scars. In documentaries that speak of scandal but not of survival. These kings did not turn boys into queens out of love. They did it to reflect themselves in submission, to preserve their image in flesh, to build mirrors that spoke back only in adoration, even as they cracked under pressure. The real cost of this legacy is not just broken boys, it is a broken language of power, where affection means control, and silence means loyalty. Chapter ends not with a death, but with a reckoning, a call to name what was once unnamed, to unmask the rituals we still perform in softer forms, to stop mistaking devotion for erasure, and love for domination. Because if history has taught us anything, it is that power, unchecked, does not merely rule, it reshapes, it distorts, and in the end, it consumes not only its victims, but itself.